Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Chris and Stephanie Rolfe for helping set this up. It's good to be back in Jackson. I did research for my dissertation here in 2002. I teach law in St. Louis, and just to give you a little background on my book, the driving question is about a Supreme Court case in 1978 that declared diversity to be a compelling interest. The name of the case was Regents versus Bakke. The author of the case was a Supreme Court justice from Richmond named Lewis F. Powell, Jr. In Bakke, Powell declared that diversity was a compelling constitutional interest on par with national security. No one had ever thought that this was the case before this opinion. In the same ruling, Powell held that diversity was not the same as affirmative action, nor was it the same as reparations. Institutions of higher learning could use diversity to admit students however they wanted, and it had nothing to do with compensating individuals for past or present discrimination. This is a bit of a riddle. The Supreme Court has subsequently rewritten Powell's opinion. Sandra Day O'Connor held, well, diversity actually is a form of affirmative action. But I'm telling another story that is back in the news today because of a lawsuit against Harvard College for discriminating against Asian American applicants. You may have heard about that. Apparently, Asian American applicants are held to a higher bar than other applicants, including whites. Now, my argument in the book is that Lewis Powell believed in diversity because he came from the South. And that one thing the South contributed to the United States was a sense that a core American value was pluralism. This is salient today, in particular, as we come up on the one-year anniversary of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. You all may remember photographs from that rally held last year. One of the organizers of that rally was an individual named Richard Spencer. Spencer is a self-proclaimed white nationalist. He was a PhD student at Duke, but I think when he described his project to his advisor, he probably got an F and was dismissed. I think he lives in his mom's basement now. He's good-looking, he's well-dressed, he looks like he just went to Brooks Brothers. And he has a theory, and his theory is that diversity has ruined America. And that what we need to do is we need to peacefully create places in the United States where groups can go and celebrate their heritage. And he's interested in celebrating European heritage, which he thinks has been lost. Now, the interesting thing about Charlottesville is the reason for the rally was the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. I argue that the South was actually a wellspring of diversity, and if you trace it from Lewis Powell to Richmond, it's a direct line. But then if you look at Southern writers and intellectuals, people like Eudora Welty, Robert Penn Warren, Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, and William Faulkner, you can see traces of that thinking in their work as well. So I just drove down from Oxford this morning, where I'm at Faulkner Camp. I have a 9-year-old who's going to camp next week, and I told her, Daddy's got to go to camp this week in Oxford. We've had picnics at Roanoke, we've had panels, we've had a little bourbon, which Faulkner, as you all know, enjoyed, but couldn't purchase. When he began writing The Sound and the Fury in 1927, we were in the middle of Prohibition. Prohibition, for someone who liked to have a drink, was a direct infringement on personal liberty. William Faulkner had to find a connection that could get him some hooch. He couldn't get any of the good stuff because all the distilleries were closed. He then hid what he could get in his yard. According to Joseph Blattner, he buried it. This, I argue, was part of a general frustration that William Faulkner started to develop in the 1920s about the direction that the United States was going in. I believe he started to get frustrated that the United States was becoming paranoid, and over-regulated, obsessed with trying to maintain what at the time was called an Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. There are several examples of this in law. One was a string of immigration restrictions passed by the federal government in the 1920s that restricted immigrants from Central and Southern Europe. The idea was that America's stock had traditionally been from Northern Europe, and that new immigrants were coming to the United States that threatened to undermine it, primarily Catholics from places like Italy, Croatia, Greece, and that these folks were going to undermine our Protestant civilization. And there was a general idea that Protestant civilization had explained the rise of the United States and the rise of Great Britain as well. And our English heritage, including our common law heritage, was an Anglo-Saxon heritage. And the Anglo-Saxons, the theory went, were early German tribes who had gotten in little boats from Germany to England and conquered it. When Woodrow Wilson wrote his dissertation in grad school, he interchanged the word Anglo-Saxon with Aryan. And the idea of an Aryan people, or an Anglo-Saxon people from Northern Europe, really replaced earlier ideas that Western civilization came from Southern Europe, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, this kind of thinking, Anglo-Saxonism, becomes a major part of the 1920s. Not just immigration restrictions, not just prohibition. The second Ku Klux Klan celebrates Anglo-Saxonism. The Klan reforms in 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and they include not just African Americans on their hit list, but also Catholics and people of Jewish faith. And they start to argue that America needs to become 100% American, and we need to go back to our Anglo-Saxon Protestant roots. We need to keep non-Protestants out. A third factor of this was eugenics, the rise of a new science of racial health. Part of the argument behind prohibition was that we were going to improve the health of people. We were going to solve problems like poverty by making sure that people didn't devolve into alcoholism. But we were also going to do other things. We were going to sterilize the feeble-minded. So there was laws across the United States, usually at the state level, that authorized the sterilization of individuals who had committed crimes or had other problems. Carrie Buck became a famous defendant in the Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell, where Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said infamously, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That at the time was progressive thinking, that we could solve social problems by making sure people who had problems didn't reproduce. That carried over into birth control. Margaret Sanger, who began to propagate the idea that birth control should be widely available, focused on immigrant Catholic mothers and said immigrant Catholic mothers are coming to the United States and they're having too many kids, and we need to provide them with birth control. This would improve racial health. And this was progressive, forward-looking thinking. So I want to stress that. And it was coming from institutions like Harvard, Princeton, Yale. There are ideas that race was tied to civilizational success and that certain races were more successful than other races. And there are ideas that if the races mixed, then there would be civilizational decline. Now, you may be saying, well, I don't believe that. But here is a point that underscores just how bad things were getting in the 1920s when Faulkner started writing. In his recent book, Black Earth, Tim Snyder, a historian at Yale, who's written about the Holocaust, has a section on a young World War I veteran from Austria named Adolf Hitler. Hitler comes out of World War I convinced that the United States is the preeminent world power. And in his memoir, which he wrote in jail in the 1920s, it's published in 1924, and apparently Hitler decided he was going to write a memoir before his career took off. Most people write them after their careers took off. But he decided, what the heck, I'll just write one now. And there's a passage in there on the United States. So if you don't get Snyder's book, you can go straight to the source. And Adolf Hitler writes, the United States is the preeminent world power. Europe has destroyed itself. Germany's in ruins, England, France are in ruins, the lost generation, millions of people have been killed. And Hitler looks to America and says, that's the model. That's what we need to do. And there are two things that he focuses on in the United States. One is he looks at the United States and he writes, the United States is an Aryan nation, because the United States has used immigration laws to keep out people from Central and Southern Europe, and it has preserved its Teutonic heritage. The largest immigrant group to the United States, even today, is German Americans. The 2010 census recorded more Americans who identified with German heritage than any other group, but that's been lost because of World War II and World War I, where German Americans faced quite a bit of discrimination. Anyway, Hitler's looking at the United States. He says these immigration laws make sense. And then he looks at something else. He looks at what the United States did to Native Americans. And according to Snyder, this was a common thing in Germany. There were German authors who wrote books for children about the Wild West. And Adolf Hitler, according to Snyder, and I'm trying to sell my book, but I'm selling his book too, says that Adolf Hitler used to play cowboys and Indians as a little kid. And there were books about German settlers who went to places like New Braunfels, Texas, which is a German settlement. St. Louis was a German city in the 19th century. Huge migration. Anheuser-Busch was German, came over in 1848 after a failed revolution. According to Hitler, what the United States has done is that it removed all the non-Aryan people, and he's thinking about Native Americans, and just gotten rid of them. And he decides that's what we need to do. That would be a better idea in his mind than creating an empire. He talked about the British Empire, and he said the British Empire is done. The problem with the British Empire, according to him, was it relied on distant colonies, places like India, China, and the people in those colonial areas were not Aryan or Anglo-Saxon. And Hitler predicted this is not going to work. They're going to rebel. They're going to revolt, and it's going to fail. Better to command a continent, to create a continent of a unified people, all of the same race. That's the secret to success. And sure enough, that's his plan for World War II. Now, there's a second book that also focused on this, and these are recent books. The second book, written by James Whitman, who's a law professor at Yale, is called Hitler's American Model. It picks up the same argument, and it looks at lawyers that the Nazis assigned to study American law. So, according to Whitman, Nazi lawyers started to study American law in the 1930s for the same reasons that Hitler was looking at the United States, to try to figure out what Germany could do to create this Aryan nation. They focus on three laws that they like. One are immigration restrictions. They decide, we like this, we want to keep out people who are non-German speaking, non-Aryan. Two, they liked bans on interracial marriage. They said this is something that we can use in Germany. And three, they liked mandatory rules on sterilization. And they decided that eugenics is something that we in Germany can get into. The one thing they did not like, though, and that they rejected, was segregation. And this introduces my project. The problem with segregation, according to Whitman and according to the Germans, was segregation created a dual society. Segregation created spaces for different peoples to live in close proximity, to work together, but then also to maintain their own identities. The Germans feared that if they went for this kind of a system, according to Whitman, it would allow too much autonomy for Jewish Germans. They would create their own communities, their own institutions, their own traditions, and that these would then threaten the idea of an Aryan nation. Now, what I try and do in my book is show that that's precisely what happened in the American South. By going towards a system of segregation, as opposed to a system of exclusion, which is what happened to the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Cherokee, who were removed from the South. By going to segregation, the South created racial space. And in racial spaces, and specifically in African American spaces, African Americans formed their own institutions, their own traditions. Some even argued their own culture, their own businesses, fraternal organizations, churches, and schools. And as African Americans left the South during the Great Migration, took many of these traditions to other places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and then through media, print media platforms like the Chicago Defender, stayed in touch with communities in the South. And this created a parallel universe that was African American. And in that universe, African Americans began to cobble together a critique of America, of Anglo-Saxonism, of eugenics, of forced sterilization, of all of these things that had been majority initiatives during the first decades of the 20th century. Those critiques then, by the end of World War II, become ascendant. They then become adopted by some of the highest-ranking officials in the United States government, including Harry Truman, who in 1946 calls up A. Philip Randolph from Florida, who's a civil rights activist, and says, I need some help. I need to redefine the United States. I want to distance ourselves from Nazi Germany because we've just fought this huge war, and we don't want anything to do with this old talk about creating a racially pure state. And A. Philip Randolph hands Harry Truman a blueprint for civil rights that will then transform American law. Harry Truman will appoint a committee for civil rights, and that committee will then put together a plan that the Supreme Court will follow, and then through the civil rights era, even though there's resistance, of course, the United States will gradually redefine itself, and we will, as a nation, forget that in the 1920s, we were going down the same road as Germany was going, and in fact, we were leading the way, and Germany was following us. Today, how do we remember the 1920s? The Jazz Age, an African-American art form. We completely forget that it was the Anglo-Saxon supremacy age. Now, for William Faulkner, this was a problem. He personally believed, I argue, that the United States was going too far. It was forgetting things like liberty. It was forgetting the things like creative self-expression, individual identity. Faulkner, coming out of the South, starts to write a critical account of this progressive era. And he starts to celebrate the black experience. To illustrate, I'm going to talk a little bit about his book, Absalom, Absalom. So this book was published in 1936. This is the height of the rise to power in Germany of the Nazis. It would be hard to think about race in the United States in 1936 without thinking about the Nazis. Already there was talk of the Nuremberg laws that were passed to try to encourage Jews to emigrate out of Germany. And already there's talk in Germany about creating a white homeland. Faulkner, I submit to you, rejected this. He thought that this was the wrong way to go. He thought that this was building on all the negative things that he had already seen. So he writes a story, and he sets it in the antebellum period, before the Civil War, about a poor white boy, Thomas Sutpen, who as a child in Virginia goes to a plantation house, knocks on the front door, and asks to be admitted. He's met by a slave who says, I'm sorry, but you can't go in through the front door. You've got to go around the back door because you're not of the appropriate class. In the story, this makes Sutpen furious, and he dedicates the rest of his life to becoming a plantation owner and to building a huge house where he's going to be the boss and he's going to let people come in and out as he pleases. He goes to Haiti. He becomes an overseer. He fathers an interracial son in Haiti, who then comes back to haunt him in Mississippi. That son, Charles Bond, looks white. Now, at first blush, this novel appears to be an allegory of the Old South. It's a rise and fall drama that mapped onto Faulkner's own mythology of an ascendant plantation elite, wiped out by a war and poverty. However, the story actually plumbed darker depths that had more to do with the 20s and the 30s than the antebellum period. Casting Thomas Sutpen's tale not simply as a romance about the Old South, but a set of memories recovered by Quentin Compson while a student at Harvard in 1909. So the whole story is narrated by an undergrad at Harvard long after the Civil War. Quentin struggles with Sutpen's legacy in the book, in part because the South lost the war, but also because Sutpen didn't seem to live up to the ideals of the Old South. He wasn't an honorable figure. He was greedy. He was selfish. He was rapacious. Sutpen's rise seemed to be a paradox. If he was more like a greedy, rapacious Northerner or Snopes than he was a romantic, honorable Southerner or Sartorus, then what sense did it make for Faulkner to argue that he had risen to ascendance before the Civil War? Sutpen seemed to suggest that Faulkner's earlier thinking about the South as a noble place before the war and then a declining place after the war was wrong, and that it had actually begun declining before the war. This was one of the arguments made by a group of literary scholars in Nashville known as agrarians. For them, the answer to Faulkner's riddle was that Thomas Sutpen was not even a Southerner. He was an outlier. His story was not an allegory of the Old South. According to Clanth Brooks, one of the Nashville fugitives or agrarians, Thomas Sutpen resembled a modern American, not an old Southern colonel. He was a planner who worked by blueprint and on schedule. He wrote, someone who was rationalist, scientific, not traditional, and who ultimately resembled a Yankee, not a Southerner at all. Sutpen's outsider status, according to Clanth Brooks, who was writing in Vanderbilt, was linked to his downfall. Unlike the mythic gentleman of the South, Sutpen pursued modern ideals, individual achievement, naked ambition, and immediate self-gratification. He flouted conventional norms and suffered for it. Perhaps the most important norm that he trampled, according to Brooks, was the, quote, dark secret that prompted the Sutpen tragedy. As Brooks put it, it was his violation of the South's long-standing prohibition against interracial sex. Careless in his pursuit of sexual partners, Sutpen fathered 2 interracial children, first in Haiti by accident, then intentionally in Mississippi with a former slave, yielding a daughter who burned down his mansion. This is the driving tension in the book. As Charles Bond is interracial, but he appears to be white. He shows up in Yoknapatawpha County wearing fancy clothes with a lot of money, and he starts courting Thomas Sutpen's daughter, who is his half-sister, and then he befriends Thomas Sutpen's son, Henry, who is his half-brother. And everyone assumes that he's white. No one realizes that he has a trace of black heritage from his interracial mother in Haiti. And then in the big reveal of the book, Charles Bond says, I'm black, and I'm going to marry your white daughter. And this leads to the downfall of the family because Henry, the white son, shoots Charles Bond, and at that point he becomes a criminal, he has to go on the run, and the whole plantation dream falls apart. Now, many read this and continue to read this as a story about the curse of slavery. Clanth Brooks argued that's an oversimplification. Slavery was an evil, yes, but other slaveholders avoided Sutpen's kind of problems and were exempt from his special kind of moral blindness. That blindness proved central to the novel, not a critique of slavery per se, but rather a problem with slavery that had long bothered white Southerners' interracial progeny. This is Clanth Brooks speaking, who's writing as a scholar in the 30s. He's in Nashville. Though an embarrassment to polite society, interracial children proved a recurring byproduct of slavery, particularly in Mississippi, a frontier region that, according to Ed Baptist, whose book The Half Has Never Been Told is about slavery in Mississippi, Mississippi was a sexual playground for rapacious slave owners who exploited female slaves. Subsequent generations of interracial children emerged across the South, blurring what Dan Sharfstein has called the invisible line of race. Not only fooling hapless owners like Thomas Sutpen, but undermining the moral basis of slavery itself. Slavery hinged on a legal concept. White was free, black was slave. But interracial children were incentivized by slavery. There was an incentive for white slave owners to exploit slave women. The progeny were then monetized. It was a way to increase their wealth. According to Baptist, this happened over and over. It happened at the highest levels of Southern society. Thomas Jefferson was involved in a relationship with a slave, Sarah or Sally Hemings, who was herself the product of a relationship of an interracial family. This was a dilemma. if slavery hinged on a clear delineation between white and black as a matter of law, but also incentivized liaisons between white and black, that's a nice way of putting it. Ed Baptist calls it rape. How could the South's racial order survive? How could you have a system based on race if there's interracial people coming out of the system? According to Thomas Jefferson, who was in an interracial relationship, the answer was morals. Sutpen lacked them. Apparently Jefferson did as well. Sutpen failed to select or vet his partners appropriately. According to Brooks, this was his sin. He exhibited an innocence about racial pedigree and breeding that would lead him to carelessly father an interracial child, Charles Bond, who would follow him to Mississippi and ultimately destroy his life. This is a stark juxtaposition. As Faulkner told it, Sutpen's son Henry was alerted to the fact that Charles was his half-brother but didn't really care. He agonized over it, but he finally concluded that Charles should marry his sister Judith, regardless of the fact that they were related. However, once Henry learned that Charles was black, when he confesses it, in order to destroy the family, he moved to stop the marriage, leading Charles to raise the specter of miscegenation as an offense even worse than incest. This underscored the centrality of interracial relations to Thomas Sutpen's demise, according to Clint Brooks, even as it provided a clue into Faulkner's own attitudes about race at the time he wrote the novel in the 1930s. Now, I'm going to argue that Brooks is wrong. Faulkner is not concerned with interracial progeny. Faulkner is writing against an obsession with racial purity, and he's making an argument about the 1920s and the 1930s, not really about the Old South. Though interracial relations had been a persistent problem in the Old South, the word miscegenation, which comes up again and again in the book, was a post-Civil War word. It had not existed pre-Civil War. Slave owners used the term amalgamation to describe interracial relationships. Miscegenation only became popular in the South after the Civil War. It was first coined, believe it or not, in New York in 1864, and then publicized by Southern proponents of Jim Crow, a system very different from slavery, and that it made the prohibition of interracial relationships or liaisons a cornerstone of a new legal order in the South. This was a turn away from slavery's tacit encouragement of interracial progeny. Now, this is an important point I make in the book. As a matter of law, the legal system of segregation of slavery was justified by slave owners as a type of humanitarian project. So, believe it or not, the rationale for slavery before the Civil War was that slavery was assimilating people from non-Christian places into Christian society and was civilizing those people. It was salvaging people and then caring for those people and helping them. Now, today, most historians view this as baloney, but it was genuinely felt at the time. This was the rationale. This is why soldiers marched off into battle to defend a morally good system, not an immoral system. Jim Crow had a very different aspirational goal. It was another legal system, but the goal there was not to incorporate people of other races, African Americans, into white society. The goal of Jim Crow was to separate African Americans and to encourage separate development, separate institutions, separate traditions, separate culture, and even what Robert Penn Warren called, in a famous essay, The Briar Patch, separate art. The aspiration behind Jim Crow, which we can also today say was baloney, was that this will produce pluralism, diversity. It'll encourage artistic, creative self-expression, and it'll encourage a black culture that is vibrant and thriving and a white culture that is vibrant and thriving, and these separate cultures will live together in harmony in the South. That was the vision that people like Robert Penn Warren had in the 1920s, and that people like Henry Grady, founder of the Atlanta Constitution, Charles Brantley Aycock, governor of North Carolina, expressed when they rationalized Jim Crow. Now, what they didn't mention was it also included disfranchisement, humiliation, separate accommodations, underfunding of black accommodations, and violence. The aspirational vision was this was about pluralism or diversity. Now, this was the world that Faulkner grew up in, and the world that Quentin Compson grew up in. A plural world, a diverse world. By having Compson narrate the story of slavery through Charles Bond and Thomas Sutpen, Faulkner invites us to reconsider the antebellum South through the lens of the Jim Crow South. And instead of doing it, makes a commentary on the course the South had taken after the war. Now, here the problem that Faulkner finds with the course the United States was taking in the 1920s is that just as the South was going towards racial segregation, it was adopting a paranoia over racial purity. And this paranoia was then filtering into restrictions like prohibition, but also sterilization rules and legal measures that infringed on the liberty of whites. Take The Sound and the Fury. Published in 1929, in the middle of Prohibition, at the height of this Anglo-Saxon moment, Faulkner kicks off the novel with a white narrator, Benji, who is intellectually disabled. At the time, someone like Benji would have been sterilized. Someone like Benji would not have been elevated as an example of the white South or the white United States. Someone like Benji would have been sequestered, hidden away, and made sure never to reproduce. Faulkner leads off his novel with an intellectually disabled white person saying, "You want to talk about white supremacy? Here's my narrator." He's reacting to this impulse in the 1920s to create a master race. He's saying, I'm not going to create a master race. I'm going to start off my book with a white person who has problems. And then I'm going to talk about all the other white people who have problems, including Quentin Compson, who commits suicide. If you're superior, why would you kill yourself? At Harvard. You'd think that he'd go on and have a great career. His brother robs his sister. The only figure in Sound and the Fury who's a stalwart, heroic individual is Dilsey, who endures. And this marks a shift in Faulkner's thinking and a sign that he's starting to view the South as pluralist, and he's starting to view the white South as going down a road that Nazi Germany was going down, but the black South as a source of hope. A parallel world that was insulated from all these white problems and white paranoias about race. The one paranoia that emerges after the Civil War is this paranoia over racial purity that is the centerpiece of the novel Absalom, Absalom. The struggle for white supremacy, in Faulkner's view, had actually paradoxically yielded to white decline, a paranoid obsession with race that compromised white pretensions to superiority by exuding insecurity, as evidenced in Southern law. So, just to give you an example of how race became even more intense after the Civil War, in 1822, long before the war, Virginia passed a law stating that to be defined as multiracial or mulatto, a person had to have at least 1/4 African ancestry. This was one grandparent. This standard remained in place until 1910, the year that Quentin Compson goes to Harvard, when the standard was changed to 1/16. In 1924, under the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia, even the 1/16 standard was done away with. This law defined a person as legally black for classification and legal purposes if they had any African ancestry. This becomes known as the one-drop rule. Here's the thing about this rule. This would apply to people who even on the surface appeared to be completely white, like Charles Bond. Other states followed. Tennessee and Louisiana adopted one-drop statutes in 1910, Texas and Arkansas in 1911, Mississippi in 1917, North Carolina in 1923, Virginia in 1924, Alabama and Georgia in 1927, Oklahoma in 1931. That Quentin focuses on these questions at Harvard is no accident, for it was schools like Harvard who began to propagate scientific theories in the 1890s and 1910s that even a trace of genetic heritage could reemerge. The science of evolutionary biology develops into the science of genetics, and geneticists start to argue that trace or latent genes can reactivate in subsequent generations, so even though one may appear to be of a particular race, if one had any interracial background, that could then pose a problem. This became cutting-edge theory. Schools like Harvard and Yale taught classes in anthropology, sociology, economics, and history that linked racial purity to civilizational success. This becomes the focus of the Scopes trial in 1927 in Tennessee. Even today, we remember the Scopes trial as a case of modern science defeating backward thinking. The book at issue in the trial, Civic Biology, was actually a very racist text. It taught not just evolutionary biology, but social evolution, social Darwinism. It included 5 races on the earth and named Anglo-Saxon Protestants as superior and everyone else as inferior. And this was advanced learning at the time. If you believed in creationism, then you didn't know what you were talking about. You had to believe in racism. Quentin focuses on this in Harvard because it's coming out of Harvard. It's not coming out of the South. People in the South look to places like Harvard and they start to adopt these new racial theories. The South had been much less focused on racial purity during the antebellum period. During the antebellum period, if someone like Charles Bond showed up in town with money, nice clothes, good looking, he would have been accepted. No one could tell what his ancestry was. No one really cared. Virginia and South Carolina both proposed early versions of the one-drop rule before the Civil War. There were measures to try to refine and try to control this question of interracial progeny. And both legislatures struck down the laws under the premise that they would implicate the leading families of the states who had interracial ancestry. So pre-Civil War, in a weird way, race is much more fluid and it's much less policed. After the war, during the height of this progressive era thinking that's coming out of places like Harvard, people like Quentin Compson are saying, oh my God, the South is going to enter into a decline because we're not observing these new theories of race. Interracial sex assumed a toxic cast after the war, as an emerging generation of white leaders argued that race mixing threatened civilizational collapse, a theory that was propagated by scholars in new disciplines like anthropology, sociology, economics, and older disciplines like history. Gregory Downs has written an article about this explaining that pro-white supremacy campaigns of the 1890s, the very campaigns that led to the rise of Jim Crow law, were part of a Mandarin moment, i.e. an educated, elite intellectual moment led by a newly self-conscious group of public intellectuals in the South. Glenda Gilmore calls these the new white men who came to believe in social scientific theories of progress, race, reproduction, degeneration, all coming out of northern schools. These theories, in a manner that's important to understanding the rise of Jim Crow as a legal system, rejected Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection as inefficient. So Darwin comes up with the theory that over time species evolve naturally. At this point, people started saying, well, we can't wait for natural selection. That's going to take too long. And you're going to have all kinds of weird people emerging. We need artificial selection. We need to use law to encourage good breeding. And this then becomes one of the justifications for racial segregation and for bans on interracial marriage, interracial liaisons, in order to promote racial health. And these are progressive ideas. And so we think of the 1890s in the South as this low point where the South is descending into this era of Jim Crow. But in fact, people in the South who were mounting or supporting these systems were looking at Harvard and Yale and saying, we need to catch up and do what you all are doing. Faulkner mocks these programs. By the 1930s, he is convinced this is absolute baloney. This is insane. He mocks this in Absalom, which is in many ways, a farce. The idea that someone would show up in the antebellum South who had a trace of African heritage and suddenly say, I'm black, would simply not have happened. In the antebellum South, Charles Bond would never have identified as black. If he wanted to hurt his father, he would have shot him. He wouldn't have said, I'm black. No one would have believed him. It's only after the Civil War that the idea that he might have a trace of black heritage, that then could destroy the whole family. But in Faulkner's eye, this is crazy. This whole idea of purity and trace genetic heritage is nonsense. Had Charles Bond actually lived in the antebellum South, he would have automatically been considered white and encouraged to marry Judith. Sure, you've got money, you look good, take this daughter who's not got a lot of prospects in Yoknapatawpha County. The dating scene there is probably not too good. It's a remote region. I don't think anyone would really care where Charles Bond came from. Even if he'd wanted to humiliate his father, he never would have done it by claiming he was black. No one would have believed it. He wouldn't even have believed it. Only in the paranoid phase of Jim Crow and the progressive era, the 1920s, the rise of eugenics, white supremacy, and Nazi-style theories, does this story make any sense. But it's a critique of these paranoid fears. And this was not the only part of the Jim Crow era that Faulkner critiqued in his work. He also went after two other problems with the 1920s that came to characterize the era. One was the rise of rapacious free market capitalism. This was an era when the Supreme Court and the federal government were promoting the rights of property over the rights of labor, promoting business under a variety of legal doctrines like substantive due process. Faulkner here agrees with Clint Brooks and the agrarians that capitalism was undermining community, individuality, creative self-expression. He doesn't buy into the agrarian argument that the Old South was a romantic era of honorable, respectful people. He says, no, it was capitalist, and that's what Sutpen was doing. But this capitalism continues. It ramps up after the war. Faulkner stages a marriage between capitalism and evangelical Protestantism in the novel. Thomas Sutpen marries Ellen Coldfield, the daughter of a preacher. Their betrothal supper featured no wine at the table, quote, and no whiskey before or after. This is Faulkner saying, this is something I object to. This marriage of evangelical Protestantism, business, and an obsession with race all mean I cannot get a drink. I want to walk down to the square in Oxford and get a glass of wine. He can't do it. And so this leads him in a very personal way to react to this national trend. It isn't just the South. And here the South, ironically, becomes a source of hope in America. And here, when we're thinking about the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, this is something people like Richard Spencer miss. The legacy of Robert E. Lee is a legacy of diversity. It's a legacy of a dual society. It's not the legacy of the neo-Nazis. The idea of flying a Nazi flag with a Confederate flag doesn't work. They're different types of racial supremacy. They're different varietals. It's like wine. You can be a Nazi, but if you're going to be a Nazi, you can't celebrate the South, because the South never went down that road. In fact, the Nazis said, we don't want to go down that road. And so that's an irony that is lost on people like Richard Spencer, which probably explains why he failed out at Duke. And here's the thing, here's the problem I have with Spencer. So Spencer is allegedly the person who coined the term alt-right. And the problem is every time he gets up to speak, someone punches him in the face. Like you probably saw the clip after the Trump inauguration where Richard Spencer was in D.C. and he was going to make a speech, and someone jumps out of the bushes and punches him in the face. And the problem is he never gets to speak and be debated. Someone needs to debate him on some of these points. I mean, he's really wrong about the South. If he wanted to celebrate Robert E. Lee, he wouldn't be talking about a white homeland, because the South decided after the Civil War it wasn't going to go down that direction. In the 1870s, there was a movement coming out of Texas and Louisiana to leave the South. Freed slaves started buying tickets on riverboats. They came up to St. Louis, and they hoped to go to Kansas. They became known as the Exodusters. While in St. Louis, some of the organizers of the movement wrote to the federal government and said, "Dear Washington, we would like you to set aside land for us in the West, just like you've done to the Native Americans. We want to live away from white people. We want to have autonomy. We want to have our own societies. We don't want anything to do with this place." Guess who said no? Southern delegates. Congressmen, senators said, "No, we're not going to give them land in the West. We need them. We need African Americans. We like African Americans. They like us. They're being lured away by snake oil salesmen." And so that's very different from the road that Hitler goes down, which is he removes people. First, it's through out-migration, the Nuremberg laws, and then by 1942, it's mass murder. That's removal. But that's not the road the South takes. The South takes a pluralist path. And what happens? Even people like William Faulkner start to say, you know what? The source of hope here, the source of light here in Oxford, is the African American side of the story. Faulkner's most powerful African American character was Lucas Beecham in Intruder in the Dust, a, quote, intractable and composed figure who boasted mixed heritage like Charles Bond, but stood up to whites. He refused their handouts. He resisted their advances. He didn't court their daughters. He didn't befriend their sons. He waited patiently in jail while he was gradually exonerated from a false murder charge, the main theme of Faulkner's 1948 novel, Intruder in the Dust, which he writes after World War II. And now he's convinced we're going to double down on Black America. White supremacy has destroyed itself. And even Harry Truman agrees. Beecham emerged an exemplar, not just of the Black South, but the South itself, one of the few descendants of Southern aristocracy in Faulkner's fiction who did not succumb to moral decline. That Beecham happened to be black was important, for it underscored Faulkner's larger sense that even as racial discrimination had plagued the South, so too had it forged black character, tempering it like steel. Beecham's white attorney, Gavin Stevens, hints at this, reasoning that Southerners were a homogeneous people, and black Southerners possessed even better homogeneity than whites. For they had exhibited patience, even when they didn't have hope, and possessed not just the will, but the desire to endure. That's Faulkner's famous line, which he says at his Nobel Prize speech. He's not talking about the white South. He's talking about African Americans, who he is now starting to view as a source of renewal. Now, Thaddeus Davis has argued, well, this is stereotypical. He's stereotyping people, and he was. But in his imagination, what's interesting is he's starting to say, no, what we've got here is something interesting. We have a diverse, plural society, and there's hope here, but we have to recognize it's not necessarily coming from white progressives. His reference to homogeneity was an intriguing allusion to the idea that African Americans comprised a coherent social group embodying the best of the South, a committed resistance to the vagaries of modern life, and a stoic integrity unshaken even by the threat of imminent death. Faulkner recognized injustice in Jim Crow, but also saw something inspirational about the black struggle. Quote, we, argued Gavin Stevens in Intruder in the Dust, should confederate, swap African Americans the rest of the economic and political and cultural privileges which are his right for the reversion of his capacity to wait and endure and survive. The idea of a racial swap seemed to be a move to find a way forward in the South and perhaps the United States, one that looked to the black experience as a source of hope, but also envisioned a world of equal rights and legal equality. Now, then we would prevail, declared Stevens, and I'll conclude on this. Together, we would dominate the United States. We would present a front not only impregnable, but not even to be threatened by a mass of people who no longer have anything in common save a frantic greed for money and a basic fear of a failure of national character, which they hide from one another behind a loud lip service to a flag. This is Faulkner speaking to Richard Spencer, saying the South will save America. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If anyone has any, raise a hand. We'll bring a microphone, which I think is working now.
Hello, thanks for your talk. My question is about Lewis Powell, and I'm curious about the extent to, like, the way that you talk about Faulkner and his ideas about diversity or pluralism, I imagine are very different than the ideas that Lewis Powell has, because of course, one of the big critiques of Bakke is that the idea of diversity is against the kind of racial justice, like reparations, essentially, argument for affirmative action. So did Justice Powell, did he struggle with that? Did he think, what was his idea of this, broader idea of cultural pluralism, I guess?
So good question. Now, Faulkner, who I'm celebrating, was not a civil rights activist. So James Baldwin lit into William Faulkner. In 1956, Faulkner wrote a letter to the North saying, it's time to calm down. We need to go slow. And he's writing to the NAACP. And we need to let this play out gradually. And James Baldwin writes, William Faulkner, the, quote, squire of Oxford, has got it wrong. We don't need to go slow. We need to do this now. And Faulkner, like Powell, didn't necessarily believe in aggressive state measures to achieve racial equality, programs like affirmative action. Faulkner is saying we just need to recognize the value of what we have down here. And so Powell, in an interesting way, shares with Faulkner this cultural appreciation for the black experience, but he rejects the idea that centralized state programs are going to help. And Powell, in a string of other opinions, his other most interesting opinion to me involves the Mississippi University for Women, where a male student applied to become a nurse and was rejected. And he challenges this exclusionary rule, saying, I want to go to this all-female school because I want to be a nurse. And the court rules in his favor and says there shouldn't be mandatory state-sponsored same-sex schools. And Powell writes a dissenting opinion saying, today an aspect of diversity in America dies, and that's gender segregation. And Powell viewed the idea of segregated schools as an aspect of pluralism because there were different options and different places where people could go. And in these different places, the government couldn't dictate what people were saying or learning. And in a weird way, I think Faulkner is more eloquent than Powell. I think Faulkner was a little more tormented than Powell. I don't think Powell drank that much. I don't think he really needed a glass of bourbon every night. But it's a similar line of thinking. It's a form of diversity, but it's not the diversity that we're familiar with, which is really much more influenced by Canadian multiculturalism, believe it or not, which is about achieving equality. That's where multiculturalism was forged with these struggles with the French and English politics there. And today we tend to think, diversity is this northern concept. But what Powell's writing about has nothing to do with equality. And so if there's a downside to the story, it's he shuts the door on reparations in Bakke. And that's the negative here. But the positive is he elevates diversity to a very high level of constitutional protection.
Very interesting, very interesting. You studied Harvard and Yale and a little of Columbia, I know in anthropology. But I suspect, too, that the University of Chicago School of Sociology had a large part to play in this whole scheme. Like your observation of that.
I think that's right. One of the founders of sociology, William Graham Sumner, became famous for his argument that folkways could not be changed by lawways. And his thinking, so here's an interesting story. There's a judge in Mississippi named Tom Brady from Brookhaven. And Brady was one of the inspirations for the Citizens Council movement. He gave a speech called Black Monday after Brown versus Board of Education. Tom Brady went to Yale as an undergrad. He was wealthy. And at Yale, he took classes and majored in sociology. And his professor was a guy named Albert Galloway Keller. And Keller was a protege of William Graham Sumner. And Keller at Yale taught Tom Brady all about race and civilization and how white Anglo-Saxons had succeeded and conquered the world, how the British Empire had civilized everybody. And Tom Brady goes back to Mississippi and for years writes letters to his old professor. And his letters are at Yale. I've looked at them. And he writes things like, "Dear Professor Keller, here I am in Brookhaven, Mississippi. No one knows what I'm talking about, but I'm telling them about everything you taught me at Yale about white supremacy and about how if there's integration, there's going to be civilizational collapse." And that's the tone of this Black Monday speech today. It's crazy. It's paranoid. It's like exactly what Faulkner's reacting to. But for Brady, he's remaining faithful to what he learned at Yale. And how could it be wrong if it came from Yale? And Chicago, I think, was heavily steeped in this as well. I mean, this was the coin of the realm for these elite institutions. That's right. Well, I think there were some figures who resisted this. Franz Boas at Columbia resisted this. He said, look, no, we need to get away from this supremacy. We need to study culture. So he trained Zora Neale Hurston and Howard Odum at UNC. And so there were debates, but Boas was kind of a radical guy. I think the prevailing wisdom into the 20s was this racial theory.
I think we have reached the top of the hour. I know that there will be several questions that we won't have a chance to get to. I would encourage you to come and talk with Anders over here and buy a copy of the book, which we have for sale. He'd be happy to sign a copy. Thank you all for coming. Help me thank Anders Walker for the program today.
Thank you.